Hello all, very good morning. Today we would be starting with a new chapter and that is passive voice. So, when we are talking the relationship between any language, when we are talking the voice has two varieties. When we are talking, today we are going to cover is passive voice, and the main thing that we need to remember is the relationship between the agents. Who are the two agents? The one who speaks, fine, and the second one is, this is the thing that we will take care of, the agents, the one who speaks, or you can say one who performs the action. Yes, let us take it this way, one who performs the action, and the second one is the action, and that is the voice. Yes, that is like basically let us take that is the verb which is called the voice. This is first thing that we all need to remember. This is one very important thing, that the relationship between the agents. Which two agents? The one who performs the action. Who performs the action? Fine. The action and the action, the one who performs the action, that is the speaker. The one who performs the action is the speaker, and the action, which is the verb, is called voice. See, the person who is speaking, his voice has its own impact. The action, the voice has its own relationship and impact. So, the relationship, this relationship we would be learning today is the relationship between the agents, the one who performs the action. We can even call it the speaker, but let me give it into this way, let us make it a bit interesting. Saying it, the one who performs the action, it would be easy to remember, and the action is the voice. Fine. So, this is that is voice. Fine. Now, let us understand one thing. Again, we need to remember the important thing is, see, English, in English when we are talking, in English, fine, we have, English has two voices, fine. English has two voices. This is one thing that very important we need to remember. English has two voices, fine, which is, two is active and passive. Let us remember this, it is active and passive, active voice and passive voice. So, when we are talking about the active and passive voice, now let us understand what is active and passive voice, and then let us go further in understanding completely the passive voice. See, when we are studying about the passive voice in detail, we would have some information that how would it be converted from active to passive and all. So, we would be understanding both, but basically we would get into the depth of the passive voice, because we would come across this very often. Fine. So, now let us understand how would we come across this often, and what do we need to understand, how do we utilize this thing in our communication on regular basis, so that our communication is more mastered and with less errors. So, let us understand this. So, again when we are talking, it is active voice and passive voice, fine. So, now what we need to remember is, in the active voice, fine, the subject performs the action, fine, the subject performs the action, that is one important point we would be taking care of, fine. And the agent, who is the agent? The agent receives. So, who is the agent? The agent receives. So, he is the receiver, fine, he is the receiver. Agent receives more emphasis or attention. So again please remember, in active voice when we are taking care, the subject performs the action. The subject performs the action and the agent receives more emphasis. Fine. Or the attention. How? We would now further understand in detail about it. So all the points are clear, but now again we would, so keep this in mind, so that when we are studying further we would understand it more better way. Fine. So the agent receives more emphasis or attention. Fine. Then in the passive, again in passive voice, this we were studying about the active voice. Now we are understanding the passive voice. Fine. The attention, in this again the attention of the reader is focused on the receiver. This is one important point of the action. So please remember again this point. Now the attention of the reader is focused on the receiver. Fine. Now who is the receiver? Now when we were talking, the agent receives. Fine. So who is the receiver? Understand it. Of the action. The agent receives more emphasis and the subject performs the action. Subject is performing the action, and here it is talking, the attention of the reader is focused on the receiver of the action. We would now again look into this while I will share the example coming further, but before that one more thing that I need to, or let us even share with example, let us understand some more thing. In passive voice when we are giving it, it is, let us give this example, he was killed with a gun. So this is the example that we are taking. Now let us study this, and the points, these 2 points and these points, just remember, further going when we are understanding with all the examples and in understanding better, that I will again discuss this and make our understanding more clear. So now he was killed with a gun. So now understand in this. Fine. So again when we are looking, normally what we do is we use by to introduce the passive object. So again let us remember this thing. Normally what we do, normally we use this, like when I was even earlier starting, he was killed by, suppose I am mentioning someone's name, he was killed by Hari or he was killed by Ram. Fine. So usually what we do is we use, when we to introduce the passive object, usually what we use is by. Fine. Now let us understand further, but now when we are looking is, but here we have used is with a gun. So here, but the gun is not the active subject. So please let us remember, the gun, when we are talking about a gun, the gun that we are talking about is not the active subject, is not the active subject. Just remember this. Fine. The gun, why it is not the active subject? First let us understand this, because the gun, yes, the gun did not kill him. See, he was killed with a gun, but that gun was operated by some other person. Gun itself cannot get up or cannot move and start working by itself. So again please keep this in mind, the gun is not the active subject. So it cannot be the active subject. Why it cannot be? Because the gun did not kill him. He was not killed by the gun, was killed with the gun. So because the gun did not kill him. Fine. First point we will remember is why the gun is not the subject, because the gun did not kill him. Fine. Then fine, again please remember in the active, okay, before going to this let us again understand this part is the gun did not kill him, fine, he was killed by somebody with a gun. So somebody had this gun who killed him, who killed the person. So again let us remember he was killed by somebody with a gun, fine. Again this thing, because the gun did not kill him, he was killed, fine. Now he was killed by somebody with a gun. Then again, now when we are looking in the active voice, please remember this, in the active voice what will we take care of is, it would be somebody killed him with a gun. The gun is just the instrument. So now again please let us keep in mind this important point. Now when we are first going to the active voice, fine, this is the passive voice, he was killed with a gun. So in active voice again it would be somebody killed him with a gun. Somebody, now who is that somebody we don't know, but somebody killed him with a gun, fine. Inactive again, and the gun is the instrument which has killed, with which he was killed. But again, fine, let us keep this in mind that somebody, when we are talking, somebody is the agent or the doer. This again, this is very important. When it is somebody killed him with a gun, the active voice is somebody killed him with a gun. Now somebody is the agent, fine, somebody is the main person, the doer, he is the agent or even the doer who has done the action, fine. So when we are understanding the first point, the subject performs the action. So who was the subject? Somebody was the subject, fine. So again, and over here when we are looking into the passive, the attention of the reader is focused on the receiver of the action. So again, here when we are looking this point, somebody is he was killed with a gun, but action was done by that somebody. Somebody killed him with a gun, fine, and that somebody is the agent or the doer. Now when we are talking further, we need to take care of few points, fine. In order to change the active verb to its corresponding passive form, we need to do two things, fine. And what are those two things? Let us understand it. See, mainly in order to change the active verb, fine, the active verb into the corresponding passive verb, passive form of it, we need to do two things so that we can convert the active to passive. So what are those two things? Let us understand it and keep it in mind so that it actually clarifies our concept and it helps us in communicating better. So when we are during the communication part, when we are communicating it in active or passive way, we know in a better way how to convert it to passive. In passive voice when we are talking, that is our usual thing. When we are telling about something someone did, how would we tell it? Now let me tell you what are those two things. Now let us understand it. How do we, now let us understand this use of the passive voice. Those two things that we are going to understand, those two things that we were speaking about here, that we said we need to do two things. Now what are we supposed to do? Let us understand here how, like the use of the passive voice and how do we, what are those two things? Now we will understand it in a better manner. So now let us understand it. What are those two things? First, now let us understand, we want to make the active object more important. The two things, first one is this, second point is we do not know the active subject. So, when we are looking into this example, let us understand this, because we are trying to understand the two forms. So, we need to do two things, fine. So, again when we are understanding it, first is what are these two things for the sentence that is given. We want to make the active object, fine, more important. So, we know the active object, fine. We do not know the active subject. Over there, do we know the subject? We do not know the active subject, we do not know. So, what we are doing? Again, we want to make the active object more important. So, with the first sentence, what we get is these two things clarified. Now, again let us learn how to, what is the use of the passive voice and how do we work it out, fine. Now, when we are understanding it, again guys, this is when we are saying this point is we use the passive voice when we want to make the active object more important. So, this again with these two things, with these 2 points, one thing we understand is we want to make the active object more important and we do not know the active subject. So, we use the passive voice when these two situations, and let us understand how do we do it, fine. This is the two things that we understand. Now, we use passive voice when, fine. Now, let us understand, give importance to active subject, fine. First point that we are understanding, give importance to active subject. Let me take an example of a sentence. Okay, Mahatma Gandhi was killed by Nathuram Godse. So, the example, the sentence that we have taken for the example, Mahatma Gandhi was killed by Nathuram Godse. This is the active sentence. Now, let us convert it, let us try to understand the details, fine. So, what is it? Mahatma Gandhi is, over here when we are seeing Mahatma Gandhi, fine, when we are saying here Mahatma Gandhi, he is the subject, fine, Mahatma Gandhi is the subject. Now, next is was killed is the verb, by Nathuram Godse is the object. I hope we have understood this better. Give importance to the active subject. So, over here let me ask, who is the active subject? The active subject is Mahatma Gandhi, fine. So, when we are saying give importance to the active subject. So, now let us understand the next point. The next point that we have given, let us understand that, then we will proceed further on this even. So, the next point is again when we are looking into, okay, active subject unknown. Over here when we have understood the second point, the object, fine, we do not know the active subject, So, that point again now we will take care, we will look into the active subject unknown. In that case, let us understand, fine, it is my wallet has been stolen. So, my wallet has been stolen, do you understand? So, now who is that my? Do not know. So, nothing is active, fine, again. So, who is speaking what, nothing is known. So, again when we are looking into, my wallet is the subject and has been stolen is the verb, there is no object, So, do we understand any sense of this thing in this? So, again, so please give importance that this 2 points has to be taken care. Fine. We are, when we use passive voice, so please take care of this 2 parts, 2 things, 2 points, that is, fine, we use the passive voice when we want to make the active, fine, to make the active object, fine, to make the active object more important, fine. So, again when we are looking over here, this is one way, fine, and the second thing is we do not know the active subject, we do not know the active subject. So, again please understand the first sentence and the second sentence, give importance to the active subject which we are giving here, and here when we are saying is active subject unknown, fine. So, this point we have covered, we do understand it. So, let us proceed further. Now, again note a point, note this is very important, yes, we always use by to introduce passive object. Let us first understand this. Example let me give, fine. So, now that first thing what we are noting down, use by to introduce passive object. So, which is the passive object? Cats. So, fish were eaten by whom? By cats. So, passive object is cats, fine. Now, again let me tell you the few points. Yes, so that we were talking earlier, we use the active form to say what the subject does. So, this point again let us please remember, we use active form, we use the active form to say what the subject does. When we are talking about subject, it is active voice, and over here when we are saying is, fine, we introduce the passive object by. So, again passive is again object, we introduce it by this thing. We use the active form to say what the subject does, fine. So, now let me give you some example for this. When we are taking as an example, I speak English every day at work, fine, I speak English every day at work. We will further understand how would we convert it. Now, it is only that I am giving you the example of we use active form to say what the subject does. I speak English every day at work. So, it is speaking about me, the subject, fine. Now, let me give an, okay, let us proceed further with the next this thing. We use the passive form, we use the passive form when we do not, or let us say we use passive form to say what happens when, what happens to people and things, to say what is done to them. So, now please understand this, we use passive form to say what happens to people and things, to say what is done to them, what is done to them. In active when we are talking is we use active form to say what the subject does, what the subject does, first point, and that is the active, fine. Now, for the passive, Fine, for the passive form, to say what happens to the people or things, fine, or to say what is done to them. Please understand this. This is one important catch point that we need to remember. Fine, for active, what the subject does. Fine, what the subject does. And for passive form, what happens to people and things, what happens. Fine, to say what is done to them, what is done to them. Now, let us again understand with an example. English is okay. Okay, let me give a fresh example. I repaired the flat tire on the car. I repaired the flat tire on the car. This is the active voice. This is active. This is active. The passive, when we are saying, because are you able to understand in this again? So, the passive is the car is being repaired, because again when we are saying over here in passive, what we need to understand, what is done to them. Over here, fine, what the subject does is said. Fine. Now, again I repaired the flat tire. Do we know the subject, this thing? So, now we would be talking about the action in the passive, the car is being repaired. We do not know about what in the subject is told, in the active voice what is told. Subject, are we able to know, recognize? No. So, in passive when we are going, it goes simple. Again the object, over here when we understand, it is what happens to people or things, what happens to people or things in passive when we talk, and what is done to them. Now, when we are looking into the whole sentence, what we understand is the car is being repaired. In passive it goes simple. Fine. Now, let us understand another point. We use passive. Now, we are in detail understanding is all about passive, because that is very important, and with examples we would understand it in a better way, that how regularly passive is important in our communication part. Fine. So, now we use the passive form when we do not know who did the action or have forgotten who did the action. Fine, have forgotten who did the action. So, when we are even understanding with the first sentence, are we able to clearly understand? So, simple is the car is being repaired. Fine. So, now let us understand more with a better example. This is the second point that we would be taking care. This was the first important points. Yes, so what all we needed to note, and this passive voice when we are going. Fine. So, now we use passive voice, passive form when we do not know who did the action. Please remember this, when we do not know who did the action or forgotten. So, second point, when we use the passive. Fine. So, now remember, let me give few examples. The car was damaged, or the shirts, okay, were made in China. Fine, the shirts were made in China. And another simple example let me take, the minister was murdered. Do we know who killed the minister? We do not know. So, again that point when we are saying, fine, we do not know who did the action. This is the passive voice. The minister was murdered. We do not know. Fine. So, in this case, passive voice is used in such cases. Fine. Now, the next point when we are looking at, let us go for the next point. We use the passive form when what was done in is more important than who did it. Again we need to remember this one point for passive when we use. We use the passive form when what was done is more important than who did it. Who did it is not important. What was done is more important. Fine. What was done is more important than who did it. Who did it is not more important, but what is done is more important. Let me give you the example. Okay, now let me give an example is, it was approved by the chairman last week. So, it was approved by the chairman last week. What is important? Last week it was approved. Fine. So, what was done is more important. It is very much important, was approved last week. Fine. Remember that. We will again come to these points again, or let me give an the example. It was informed only 2 days ago by the human resource manager, by the HR manager. Fine. Again please understand, when what was done is more important than who did it. Fine. It was informed only 2 days ago by the HR manager. It was already informed. What is done was already informed 2 days ago. That is more important. So, again please remember these things, how in passive it works. Fine. Then next point that we need to remember is, we use passive voice when the subject of the active sentence would be indefinite pronoun. Again this is a very important point, and we usually come across this situation. And what is that situation? We use the passive voice form when the subject of the active sentence, please remember this, the subject of the active sentence would be indefinite pronoun. Example let me give, so you will know that yes, we come across such things very often. This sort of advertisement is seen everywhere. This is the passive voice. Fine. Passive voice. Same thing, this is the passive. I first gave you the passive, now let me tell you which was the active one. Fine. One sees this sort of advertisements everywhere. This is active. So, now let us understand this. One sees this sort of advertisement everywhere. Fine. So, we are understanding the subject of the active sentence. This is one sees would be indefinite. One sees. Now, who is that one? Do we know? Which one do we know? or it's talking about everyone? Do we know? We don't know. This is again an indefinite pronoun. It is not a defined or definite pronoun. It is indefinite. So, one sees this sort of advertisement everywhere. So, now in passive what we make it simple is, this sort of advertisement is seen everywhere. This sort of advertisement is seen everywhere. We take it this way, this sort of advertisement is seen everywhere, because over here the subject, fine, in the active sentence one sees. Now who is that one? Do we know? Out of the crore of public, we know about which specific one are we talking? We don't know. That one is not defined. So it is indefinite. Fine. So I hope these points are understood. Fine. So now when we are understanding, let's go further. Now let's further understand construction of passive voice. This is again one important thing. How do we construct the passive voice? What all things that we need to keep in mind while constructing the passive voice? So what are the important points that we would be taking care of? Fine. So now again let's take care of this few things. Fine. First thing is, please let's remember the structure of the passive voice is very simple. This one thing has to be very clear to us. We need to be confident and clear, because when we understand this one point very clearly, things become simple for us, and that is the structure of the passive voice is very simple. So how simple it is, let's understand. Fine. It is, first would be the subject plus the auxiliary verb, that is be, the be form. Auxiliary verbs are the be forms. Fine. Plus main verb, and again what we will take care of is, it would be in past participle. It will be in the past tenses, so it will be in the past participle. So this first point that we need to take care of. How simple it is this. The first point that we would take care of is this. Fine. In the construction, the first point, the subject plus the auxiliary verb, be form, and the main verb. Fine. Now let's understand. Again the thing is, the main verb, let's go in detail about this. The main verb is always in the past participle, form. The main verb is also always in the past participle. Please remember this one rule, it becomes more easier for you. Then fine, the second point that we would take care is the subject, fine, of the active verb becomes the agent of the passive. Yes. So this becomes agent of the passive verb. So now again the second point that is very important and we need to take care is the subject of the active verb. The subject of the active verb becomes the agent of the passive verb. Fine. This is the second point that we would remember. Yes, next is the agent is not very often mentioned. See, this is again one thing that usually we would come across. The agent is not very often mentioned, we do not know the agent. Many times this could happen. So, again that time we need not get panicked or confused. Fine. Then what do we do next? Although, what we will do? If mentioned, although if even it is mentioned, it is preceded by and is placed at the end of the clause, at the end of the clause. See, we already have understood one point is the agent is not very often mentioned, it is not. But even if mentioned, fine, even if mentioned, although if mentioned, it is preceded by. Fine, we would again talk about it, but we would use by, that who did the action. Fine, was done by so and so. Fine, and placed at the end of the clause. Mahatma Gandhi was murdered or shot by Nathuram Godse. Otherwise, Nathuram Godse killed Mahatma Gandhi. So, Mahatma Gandhi was killed by Nathuram Godse. Fine. So, I hope we would understand this in a better manner. Next, when we are going, please again let us remember 2 points. We need to remember 2 points so that for a better understanding and no confusion. Let me tell you both the points. First point is, put the verb to be in the same tense as the verb in the active sentence. First thing that we would remember, please keep this in mind, put the verb to be in the same tense. Please remember, put the verb to be in the same tense as the verb in the active sentence. So, do not change the tense. Fine. Now, let me again, let us say in the example of this, when we are looking into over here, when we are looking into, yes, when we are looking into the examples here, let me give this example. Okay, yes, here when we are looking into the example, fine. I repaired the flat tire on the car. The car is being repaired. Again, the tense remains the same. When we see everywhere, even over here when we have seen, this sort of advertisement is seen everywhere. So, one sees this sort of advertisements everywhere. So, when we are seeing it, tense does not change, tense remains the same. So, with the examples even earlier that we have seen, tenses again put the verb to be in the same tense as the verb in the active tense sentence, like we have already understood with the examples what we have used. The tense does not change. So, please accordingly follow it. Second point that we would take care of is, use the past participle of the verb in the active sentence. Again, this is the second point that we would take care of. Use the past participle. Please keep that in mind. Use the past participle of the verb in the active sentence. Now, again, please remember one more point is only sentences containing direct objects can be made into passive sentences, because the direct object of the active sentence becomes the passive becomes the subject in fact of the passive sentence. Again the point is, if the sentence does not have a direct object, you cannot change, this is again very important point, you cannot change it into passive voice or passive sentence. This is again that we need to please take care of. Only sentences containing direct objects. Please keep this in mind, it is very important. Only sentences containing direct objects can be made into passive sentence. Fine. So, why is that? Because the direct object, fine, please remember this, because the direct object of the active sentence, the direct object of the active sentence becomes the subject of the passive sentence. That is very important. That is why only sentence containing direct object can be made into passive sentences, because the direct object of the active sentence becomes subject of the passive sentence. Otherwise, how would you convert it? Conversion becomes tougher. It is not possible to convert it to passive voice. Then, and if the sentence does not have direct object, please remember this, as it is compulsory only sentences containing direct object can be made to passive sentence. But if they do not have direct object, in that case you cannot change it into passive, there is no chances, you cannot, it is done. Fine. So, this is very important point to remember. This is again, I would say, note this down, this is very important. Fine. So, I think till now that we have understood about the rules that are supposed to be followed and the points that we need to take care of. Which are the sentences that we can convert it to passive? What are the points that we need to take care during the conversion of passive? Like when we saw the first point that we have even seen, that the subject plus the auxiliary verb, fine, subject plus the auxiliary verb, that is the B form, fine, the B, and the main verb, the past participle. So, this point, this thing would be taken care of. This is compulsory that we would take care of. Fine. So, again this is one easy thing, how the conversion happens, and the other points that we have already learned, and we would now even be learning further in our next session. So, till then, have a happy learning and enjoy.